Get this set up, I wanted to express my gratitude as well for this opportunity that has been provided by the Center for Constitutional Studies and the History Journal. I've learned a lot through putting together this presentation, and even more after. I've learned a lot from putting together this essay, and even more while I've been working for the past month and a half or so to put together this presentation. However, I think I'd be a lot happier today if I were told simply that I got third place 2 months ago, because I've been stressing about this ever since then. Now, just to get started, I wanted to ask everyone a question, and if you want to participate, that's fine. If you don't want to, feel free to decline. But there are a couple of questions I wanted to ask you. So, how many of you in this room would consider yourselves to be very religious, by raise of hand? Okay, thank you. And now, how many of you would consider yourselves to be non-religious or not too attached to your religion, or otherwise atheist or agnostic, or a category like that? Thank you. So I realize these categories are very broad, and I've just put you all into 2 different boxes that don't really account for exactly how you feel. That was intentional. Because I wanted to tell you about a court case that has been spoken about earlier today of the Little Sisters of the Poor v. Burwell. The Little Sisters of the Poor is a current controversy that the oral argument was just heard a couple weeks ago, I believe, in the Supreme Court. And the Little Sisters' side of the argument is that they are being forced to comply with a government mandate to provide contraceptives for their employees, which they believe is a violation of their religious beliefs. The Little Sisters are a religiously based service organization, and they think that contraceptives violate their beliefs, so they don't want to comply with this mandate, but they're being forced to. Of course, the opposition in this case would say that there's a simple solution to all of this, that the Little Sisters simply need to opt out and sign away the obligation to provide these contraceptives, and then a third party could do so in their stead. The Little Sisters countered that by signing away this obligation, they are being complicit with something that they view as evil, something that is contrary to their religious beliefs. Now, the interesting thing about this case that I believe is more striking than all of these different points is this quote from the Little Sisters legal representation. Although the government exempts church and church-run ministries from the HHS mandate, it argues that the Little Sisters aren't religious enough for the same exemption. Now, I just wanted to repeat that idea because a distant government body that doesn't understand the consciences of these Little Sisters determined them not religious enough for an exemption, they are now ordered to comply with this mandate. For the same reason, along with this same idea, that's why I asked you that question in the first place of how many of you consider yourselves religious or not religious, because that would be the equivalent of me then telling the people that are not religious in the room that because I've decided that you're not religious enough, you shouldn't be at this symposium. Or we could look at it the other way, because you're all too religious, you shouldn't be at this government forum. So whether we can articulate it or not, we all like the idea of freedom of conscience underlies all of our freedoms as outlined in the Bill of Rights. And it's highlighted by many of our First Amendment freedoms. For example, freedom of speech, the press, and assembly are all outward manifestations of what we believe internally. And however, I believe that there's a reason why James Madison put religious liberty first in the list, and why those who were part of this selection for the Bill of Rights made that decision, because I believe that religious liberty, with its express limitations on government actions against conscientious belief, is the best way to protect freedom of conscience. As it says in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Throughout American history, we see many examples of this idea of freedom of conscience, how it surfaced again and again, and how it has kind of made its way into what we have now as religious liberty. And I would argue that they're very similar things. This quote is from Roger Williams, who was talked about earlier by Randall Balmer. And Roger Williams was a Puritan who was exiled from his colony in the dead of winter in 1636 because of his beliefs of religious tolerance and for his beliefs of the Puritans' injustice to the Native Americans by taking their lands. And so he wrote this and many other things to be as a criticism of those who opposed his ideas of freedom of conscience. He wrote, "God requireth not an uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced in any civil state, which enforced uniformity sooner or later is the greatest occasion of civil war, ravishing of conscience, persecution of Christ Jesus in his servants, and of hypocrisy and destruction of millions of souls." On another occasion, he summed it up this way: "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." Now, Roger Williams was quite the controversial figure during his lifetime, but his legacy of rejection of traditional religious uniformity mandated by government action lived on. For example, when a bill was being promoted by Patrick Henry, a bill establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion, this bill was opposed by James Madison and others. Now, on its face, this bill seemed like a great idea. It would take public funds to promote teachers who would teach Christianity. And Christianity, in the preamble of this bill, it says that Christianity serves to correct morals, restrain vices, and promote peace. However, James Madison and others responded to this through the document that we've heard about earlier as well, the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. Because this document is so foundational about our understanding of religious liberty, I'd like it to speak for itself. "We remonstrate against the said bill," they said, "because we hold it for a fundamental and undeniable truth that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. The religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. This right is in its nature an unalienable right." Now, I wanted to highlight 2 points from this small quote from the rather lengthy document. The first is that the freedom of conscience, that the religion of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. Now, I believe that freedom of conscience, as expressed through religious liberty, is expressed here. And also that this is an unalienable right. Unalienable rights were those rights believed by the founding generation to not be given by any government or any other actor, and that which could not be taken away by any government or anyone else. Along with this, there's the quote that's been quoted as well from the letter of Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association. Now, this is the famous letter where Thomas Jefferson talks about, in the bottom here you can see a wall of separation between church and state. Now, how far should this wall go? Should it protect religion from the state? Should it protect the state from religion? Those are debates that we've had lengthy discussions about, and heated debates and court decisions have been written frequently about this question. But I wanted to highlight something that came up earlier in this letter. He said that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. And so, along with the Memorial and Remonstrance in this quote, we can learn these principles: that religion is supposed to be left to the conscience of each individual, and that freedom of conscience should be protected under religious liberty, that this is an unalienable right, and that actions are the only things that governments can punish and control when we violate other established laws, but not our opinions. I believe that through viewing these principles in this way, we can secure government in its place as secondary to our own individual purposes as we see them. And I believe that's the purpose of the founders in putting these different things together in the way that they did. However, Thomas Jefferson once said that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, and I believe that we are not being too vigilant today. For example, according to a Newseum Institute 2015 State of the First Amendment survey, the results were that 33% of Americans cannot name any of the rights guaranteed them by the First Amendment, and only 18% of individuals surveyed could list freedom of religion. So I believe that our public is grossly misinformed on this point. From this, we see disagreements from this misunderstanding, and disagreements lead to polarization. Polarization leads to abuses. For example, from the start of this address, the Little Sisters case, where they were told that they're not religious enough for a government exemption, I believe that this is an abuse of their freedom of conscience as protected by religious liberty. Another example of a potential for abuse is a Nork Center for Public Affairs research poll. And they surveyed a lot of different individuals and found that 82% of those surveyed said that religious liberty was an important thing to safeguard for Christian individuals. However, for Jewish individuals, only 70% of people surveyed said that it was a good idea to protect that right. Mormons came in at 67%, and Muslims at 61%. And last but not least, those who were surveyed said that about 60% of those surveyed believed that non-traditional or non-religious individuals should be protected in their right of conscience. Now, what that tells me is that if it were up to an average individual surveyed in this country, your freedom of conscience and religious liberty to believe and act how you desire is almost left up to a coin toss based on those percentages. For this reason, I believe it's important for us to protect each other's freedom of conscience as it's written in religious liberty. We cannot force anyone to do anything contrary to their will without risking the same thing to happen to us. Of course, the only limit to this is that the legitimate ends of government reach actions only and not opinions. So we expect that we should be law-abiding citizens and that we should not violate other established laws, but we cannot force people to believe something contrary to their conscience. Now, aside from that, the bleak results of that survey, I believe that there are certain cases that bring us reason for hope. One such case comes from the American Humanist Association v. U.S. And the American Humanist Association fought this case to afford equal rights to humanist prison organizations as those afforded to religiously based prison organizations. Now, an interesting quote from the case says that the court finds that secular humanism is a religion for Establishment Clause purposes. On its face, that might be alarming. In fact, it was alarming to me when I first read it. But I started to think about that, and I realized that if it's about affording equal protections for non-religious individuals as those afforded to religious individuals, we as religious individuals should fight for that. And we should expect the same of those who are non-religious. And of course, it applies to both sides. I don't believe we can be passive or partisan on issues that are currently affecting people's freedom of conscience and their religious liberty. If we are all protected by the same document, then religious liberty should protect all individuals, regardless of religious beliefs or lack thereof. I believe that it's our duty to defend each other's rights. Elder Dallin H. Oaks, an LDS religious leader, came to UVU 2 years ago, and he said one important way to move forward is to minimize the talk of rights and to increase talk of responsibilities. From the standpoint of religion, he said, I urge my fellow believers to remember that the scriptures contain very little talk of rights, only commandments that create responsibilities. Others, who choose to reason in pragmatic terms, should remember that we strengthen rights by encouraging the fulfillment of responsibilities. Thus, the intention of my paper and argument is to establish the significance of religious liberty and to explain that it's only significant because it protects freedom of conscience of every individual, and that even in new and unique cases that we are faced with today, there are things that we can do to protect everyone's rights while still affording the extra protections or extra things that are sought by religious organizations and others. I admit that there are limitations to my argument. This isn't a legal argument. It's actually more of a, and it's not a quick fix or a quick solution. It is, however, a perspective shift for some and a reminder for others of a classical liberal principle upon which this nation was built. And it's a principle that I believe we can all agree on. Now, I think that we're going to disagree on the specifics when gray areas occur, and when laws aren't so clear and when we have to make these changes. But it's my hope that we can continue to use religious liberty to an equal advantage for religious and non-religious individuals by remembering this idea that freedom of conscience is enshrined in religious liberty. When the framers set about to write the Constitution, they wrote in the preamble that it was their desire to create a more perfect union. They weren't promising perfection or a magical solution for all the problems. And in fact, during the convention, they had to make sacrifices on policy and moral standpoints. There were a lot of things that we look back on and we might say, what a terrible idea, like the 3/5 clause. But these were sacrifices that they made in order to go from something worse to a more perfect union. And I believe that we need to do the same, and that perhaps we need to make some sacrifices in our viewpoints to protect the religious liberty and the freedom of conscience of every individual. And as we do that, we will be able to see freedom of conscience. We will be able to see religious liberty for what it is, as freedom of conscience is inherently protected within it. Thank you.